Unfolding, Production and Process in Time-Based Media. This is the second symposium organized at the Art Institute of Chicago to address time-based media conservation, and has been generously supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We are very happy to see so many of our colleagues here, including those who are part of the Midwest Media Consortium, as well as our esteemed panelists coming from multiple fields, and those who have joined us for the first time today. The Unfolding Symposium is part of the Art Institute's Time-Based Media Initiative, which started in January 2018, following years of staff efforts to build support for such an initiative. This initiative created a space for cross-departmental collaboration, which we all really cherish, and that has already changed our institution. We are learning alongside all of you, and we deeply appreciate the unique expertise that you have built in your own institutions or in your roles as artists participating in the preservation and exhibition of your own works. We want to thank the Mellon Foundation for supporting this endeavor, and for all of the staff of the Art Institute for their tremendous efforts over this past year and a half. And while you are here for the symposium, we would also like to warmly welcome you to spend time in the museum, including visiting Andy Warhol from A to B and Back Again, which proudly integrates Warhol's videos and 16mm film projections alongside his work in other media. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Maria Kokori, our Associate Scientist for Scholarly Initiatives, who will read a statement on behalf of the organizers in the Art Institute's Time-Based Media Working Group. Thank you and enjoy.
So good afternoon, everyone. I am Maria Kokori, Associate Conservation Scientist for Scholarly Initiatives at the Art Institute, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you all today at the Symposium and Workshop Unfolding, Production and Process in Time-Based Media Art. I would like to just take a few moments of thanks. I would like to specially thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for generously supported this today event. The symposium has been co-organized jointly by the Museum's Department of Academic Engagement and Research, Conservation and Science, Modern and Contemporary Art, Photography, and Architecture and Design. So great thanks are due to the internal team of Curatorial in Modern and Contemporary, Photography, and Architecture and Design at the Art Institute, who helped to make possible this event. And this has involved tremendous amount of dedication and time. I would also like to thank Francesca Casadillo, Ann Goldstein, and Sarah Guernsey for their ongoing guiding vision and support. Finally, I wish to acknowledge the essential support of Jean Trujillo for taking on a crucial administrative role in arranging speakers, travels, and accommodation, and Christine Scott-Schultz and her team for audio and visual support. As Anne mentioned earlier, the Art Institute Time-Based Media Initiative started last year in January 2018. In the first year, we established a network of consortium members through the Midwest with the aim of diversifying the dialogue of time-based media beyond the East and West Coasts. And last summer, we hosted the first of our TBM symposiums, Unfixed, Material Challenges in Contemporary Art. Following the success of this event, and as a result of responses in the surveys, we organized a second workshop last spring on technical issues on sound and projections that brought together participants from across the US. And please note that the videos from the workshop are available on Art Institute YouTube. Internally, the initiative established a time-based media working group that has been fueled by an incredible energy across museum departments and established 2 fellowships to focus exclusively on this work, one in conservation and science and one in curatorial, supported by respectively the Granger Foundation and the Mellon Foundation. In addition, as a result of his amazing work on time-based media installation at the Art Institute for over 10 years, Jason Steck has been promoted to the position of time-based media exhibition designer. We have also been lucky to work with time-based media conservator Jeff Martin as an outside consultant on this project. This year, we will complete a comprehensive survey on the time-based media artworks in our collection. And new projects include a focus on slide conservation led by Sylvie Penisson and a case study on the Department of Architecture and Design's forthcoming exhibition, Designs for Different Futures, curated by Maite Borhabad and Zoe Ryan, and also we are planning to organize a workshop on holography. We have also begun to build an infrastructure for digital preservation. And as we look ahead to this next year, many of us hope to raise questions about how social justice issues may intersect with time-based media, exhibition, and conservation. Unfolding was organized across museum departments under the principle that questions about how we interpret the intentions of artists and how we steward works as they change over time necessitates a combination of technical, conservation, curatorial, and scholarly expertise. We wish to explore together how to build new skills in assessing the aesthetic implications of technological choices. And further, we believe that the role of artists is key to this unfolding dialogue and that conservation is an activity that occurs throughout the lives of artworks. And the more I think about it, I cannot think of more effective and fascinating combination of art, science, and technology than our specific practices that will be under discussion today. Before we start, I just have 4 practical announcements to make. Is that first, tomorrow we will be hosting a lunch after panel 4 and before the workshop, so you are all welcome. Second, for those who are not museum members or university members, we have reserved tickets to get in the Art Institute exhibition and the Warhol exhibition. Christine and Solveig and myself, we will be available for any questions you might have. And finally, the feedback we received on last year's Symposium, Unfixed, and also at the spring workshop were very critical in developing and important in developing this Symposium today. So when you check in, you receive, I'm sure that you all receive an evaluation form for this event. Please complete the evaluation even if you are planning to attend part of the Symposium. And that would help us to ensure that our future programs will meet the needs of our colleagues. So again, my thanks to all panelists who are here today and to all of you for sharing this very special day with us and attending what we hope to be an important and enjoyable event, but has already started unfolding. And without further delay, I will hand it over now to the moderator of the first panel, Mikhail Raz-Russo. Thank you.
Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say. Thank you, Maria, for that introduction, and thank you to the entire team behind this event. It really has been a collaborative effort, and it's great to finally be here. My name is Mikhail Raz-Russo. I'm Associate Curator in the Department of Photography, and I wanted to kick this 2-day convening off with a discussion about film and video works that in many ways and in very different ways defy institutional conventions and boundaries. So I'm thinking specifically about works whose use departs significantly from how it was originally conceived, works that were never intended to exist within institutions or be viewed within institutions, or works that were never intended to be public. And what I'm hoping will come out of this discussion is thinking about the how conventions relating to display, preservation, and cataloging have adapted to accommodate these works. And so with that, I want to introduce my esteemed panelists who have each done groundbreaking work in this area. So first we have Liz Johnson-Arter, an artist based in London working in film, video, and photography, but also an archivist, I would argue. Her most recent exhibition, Dusha, just closed at the Brooklyn Museum. So very glad to have her here today, all the way from London. Next, we have Abina Manning, director of the Video Data Bank at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a post that she's held for 20 years, and in that time has done truly transformative work in terms of the collection and its programming. And finally, we have Jacqueline Stewart, who is the founder and director of the Southside Home Movies Project, professor of film and cinema studies, and director of the Gray Center at the University of Chicago, and most recently named as the host of Silent Sunday Nights on Turner Classic Movies. Very cool post indeed. Thank you all for being here today. And in the conversations that the four of us have had in recent weeks, a few ideas came to the surface that kind of acted as a binding thread in all of their practices. So first, critical thinking about the choices that determine which kinds of work are preserved or collected. Second, how to, and this is quite important, how to create appropriate and responsible context for such works, and not just in terms of presentation, but also in terms of cataloging and presentation. And finally, the notion of community as an important guiding force in each of their practices. And so with that, I want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to introduce their practice, their organization. We also have a short film clip from each of them to kind of give you a sense of what the work is. And I thought it would be nice to do this chronologically in terms of the work. So I'm going to start with Jacqueline Stewart and the Southside Movies Project. And I think within the context of all the things that we just talked about, I'd love to hear about your decision to start this organization and your thinking behind what role it might play in the broader field of film history.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thanks to all the organizers of this incredible gathering. It's really kind of an honor to be part of kicking this off, this really important conversation. So let me give some background on the Southside Home Movie Project. Click. There we go. This is a project that I founded in 2005. We collect, preserve, digitize, research, and importantly, exhibit amateur films made by Southsiders. Films meaning films on film, so small gauge films, 8mm, Super 8mm, and some 16mm films. I'm not at the moment collecting videotape, although that's one of the huge goals that I have. So our archive has material that ranges from the 1930s up to the early 1980s because of that format parameter. We have almost 500 reels in our collection now, and we also, last May, launched this digital archive so that there's public access to all the films that we've digitized. So I founded the project for two reasons. One, as a film historian, I was really interested in the growing interest in non-theatrical film. Non-theatrical is an almost comically large term because most filmmaking around the world, across history, has been non-theatrical. Educational films, training films, science films, and home movies. So I was interested to think about this as a growing field in film studies because so many of the ways in which people have actually engaged with film has been outside of movie theaters, outside of the commercial feature film. And then I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I knew about projects around the country that were looking at home movies, so I was curious to know, well, what does the home movie history on the south side of Chicago look like? And it's huge. That's what I found out. There's a massive amount of material. So I was really curious to know more about the families who were making these films and how the films constituted what I think of as an alternative visual archive of Chicago history. So the ways in which these films document everyday life, and I wrote some down so I wouldn't talk too long: fashion, interior design, architecture, foodways, children's games, social dance, tourism, there's lots of vacation footage, and much, much more. And the more that I study this material, the more convinced I am that there's something about the kind of documentation that the moving image provides that resonates with people and, importantly, activates memory that's different from the ways in which it happens even with still photographs. So thinking about ways in which we can see siblings interacting with each other, or even like the way that fabric moves, or the way that people engage with different public spaces. There's a wealth of material that we can study on a visual level in these films. And then there's also a really interesting history of our relationships to and with cameras. So if we want to kind of think about the prehistories of the selfie culture that we live in today, I think home movies play an important role in that history. So issues of class, race, and place infuse every aspect of this project because it's focused on the South Side of Chicago in mid-20th century. That means that we're looking at an environment that's characterized by a very rigid racial segregation. Much of the material that we have is from African American families, though not all. And many of the neighborhoods that we focused on, like South Shore, for example, were white neighborhoods until about 1966, 67. And then they flip almost completely to become African American neighborhoods. So we've been figuring out ways to connect with some of the families who were in these neighborhoods at the time in which people were making home movies, which means that we have to sometimes trace some paths of white flight. It's also extremely important that we're doing this project at the University of Chicago, and we'll talk about some of these institutional histories and politics. The University of Chicago was a major institutional player in gentrification, urban renewal on the south side of Chicago. There's still a lot of distrust among Southsiders with regard to the university's land ownership. There was a huge fight about the fact that the University of Chicago Hospital didn't have a trauma center, and activism had to, sort of like rectify this egregious institutional irresponsibility. So what does it mean for me to come to a family and say, hey, the University of Chicago has this project, and we want to take these precious, unique family items off your hands and join them to an archive? This is an argument that I have to make over and over and over again. And I'm proud to make it because of the ways in which we make these materials speak specifically to the history that I'm talking about. And we work really hard to keep these materials in the public eye. So people donate their films. We store the originals in the University of Chicago's state-of-the-art film vault. We digitize the material. We do lots of screenings. We invite the donors to come and narrate the films because they're largely silent films. We do oral histories with the donors as well so that they can contextualize the material. So that's kind of a smaller archive within the archive. And we're hoping that this is an archive that will be of use not just to academics and students, but also K through 12 students and teachers, urban planners, community organizers, and artists. And so artists have been coming to us a lot, especially now that the material is online. Documentary filmmakers had always come because you can't find like middle-class, black, mid-century life in the whatever stock footage houses. But we've also been working with a number of artists who've done some really imaginative things with our collection. So, for example, the poet and musician Jamila Woods did a multimedia performance of her album Heaven at the Harold Washington Cultural Center. And it's an album that explores many themes, including sisterhood, water, her love of the lake. And so she went through our archive and found materials that resonated with the family histories and the kind of ecological history of the city that resonated with her, her music. And then we've been invited to be a part of a number of exhibitions. So we screen the movies in screenings, but doing things in these exhibition contexts has been very interesting as well. So we were part of the Tender House Project. This is an annual celebration in the city of Riverside architecture. So we did a screening. The museum is actually inside. We were able to set up the screen so that the films were also projecting to the public outside. And then last, I just wanted to show this image from an exhibition that we did at Arts and Public Life at the Arts Incubator on Garfield Boulevard. Called Everyday Resistance, the Art of Living in Black Chicago. And the curators did this lovely job of creating this kind of like mid-century Black living room, and we did screenings on the walls there. Finally, we did a program called Southside Sisterhood, where we invited women who were girls in the footage they gave us to talk about growing up on the south side of Chicago. And then we worked with a youth group called Global Girls, and we had a panel in which they discussed some of the similarities and differences between what it means to grow up Black and female on the south side of Chicago, and kind of intergenerational knowledge sharing in both directions. And we had these lovely breakout discussions that happened as a part of that. So I have a 2-minute clip. And it's from the Jean Patton collection, early 60s. There we go. Maybe I can narrate this. Okay, so the Pattons lived on 85th and Prairie. And I love her kitchen. I mean, what can I say? And that the gold lame pants match the kitchen. And what I love is that this film is about the kitchen. So she leaves, but the camera stays on the appliances. So she's directing her husband to capture their new kitchen. Jean Patton was a teacher at the McDade School. Her husband, who's shooting this, Robert Patton, was the first African-American lieutenant and then captain of a state police force in the United States. Then when they moved in, they were the first black family to move to that block. Then the white family started leaving, and by the early 70s, about 10 members of the Patton family had houses in this block in Chatham. And so they talked quite a bit about how important it was for them to create a sense of community there. So since Robert Patton was a police officer, a state police officer, he was able to get really close to the National Guard as they were putting out fires on the west side of Chicago in April 1968, just after the assassination of Martin Luther King. It's really rare in our collection to find this kind of like social documentation. So this box said riot, and it's one of the first things that we played. Then at the very end of the reel, he's over at the Wall of Respect, which, as everybody in this room knows, right? Like a really important public art, collective black art project on the south side of Chicago. And in talking with my colleagues, Romy Crawford and Rebecca Zorak, who've done so much important work on the wall, they really appreciate this because the wall changed over time, and so it documents some of the elements of the wall that we don't have elsewhere. So that's my clip.
The wall was destroyed in 1971, so this is one of the few video documentations, I think, or film documentations there is of it at all. So it's really interesting to hear about ways in which works can shape and form institutions, and I think in moving on to Abina's work, it's interesting to think about the inverse, the way in which institutions might shape the work that is collected. And what struck me in talking to you and hearing a bit of background about the Video Data Bank is that artists will very often adapt their work to the specifications or ideas, conceptual frameworks of the Video Data Bank. So can you tell us a little bit more about the origins of the organization and how it has evolved over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hello, can you hear me? Hello, hello.
Maybe borrow.
Yeah. Hello? Yes. Yeah, good. Okay, great, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and such a pleasure to be with my two fantastic co-presenters and Mikhail. So, I want to talk a bit about the Video Data Bank first before I move on to one of our special archives. So, for those of you that don't know or aren't familiar with what Video Data Bank is or does, we're a not-for-profit video arts organisation based at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And we came out of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in the early 70s when they had a video department there, one of the first I think the first in the country. And two grad students were employed to kind of sort out the videotapes that had accumulated there. They were called Kate Horsfield and Lynn Blumenthal, and they went on to found in 1976 the Video Data Bank as it is now, or the basis of what it is now. I thought I'd just read you our mission statement because I was kind of revisiting it recently, and it does say a lot. I think we got it down. The Video Data Bank is committed to fostering awareness and scholarship of the history and contemporary practice of video and media art, to serving the artists represented in the collection, to providing access to the collection and to ensuring the future of the collection for generations to come. And that's, you know, it's really important to us that we keep the archive, we make things available in the future. That's really, we don't know who the users will be in the future, and we don't know what the uses will be, but it's very important for us that there is a future for the collection. So it's grown since that time, 43 years, it's grown to become an active distributor of video art, providing significant works to the collections of major museums and making them available to educators, arts organisations, festivals, other kinds of screening outlets worldwide. The VDB collection now consists of more than 6,000 titles by 600 artists, representing, I say, a history of video art from the United States. There are many histories, and this is certainly a particular one. And that's something I'm interested in, like, what are these archives? What do they represent, and what do they not represent? Major components of the collection include performance, identity politics, conceptual art, activism, and experimental documentary. And I think there's always been a kind of, maybe political with a small p slant to the video databank collection, which kind of says something about who is selecting the videos for distribution. And that's another question I'm interested in, like, how do these things come to be selected? And there are lots of different things to talk about there. Over the years, we've acquired a number of special archives to the VDB collection, including complete sets of videos made by the Kuchar brothers, for instance, twin brothers who were making film in the 60s and 70s and went on to make considerable numbers of video. And the video freaks. So today I'd particularly like to talk about the video freaks. The Video Freaks were one of the first video collectives founded in 1969 by David Court and Parry Teasdale, who met each other, video cameras in hand, at the Woodstock Music Festival. Based in New York, the group soon grew to 10 full-time members, and it was men and women, which was interesting to us, who produced tapes, installations, and multimedia events with the newly available video tools. In 1971, the Freaks moved to a 27-room former boarding house called Maple Tree Farm in Lanesville, New York, operating one of the earliest media centers and a pirate TV station that broadcast locally, which is amazing to me that they had a pirate TV station. As an aside, this summer the Video Freaks celebrated their 50th anniversary at the very same Maple Tree Farm, which is now an Airbnb. Their groundbreaking programming ranged from artist tapes and performances to behind-the-scenes coverage of national politics and alternate culture. The Video Freaks archive chronicles the countercultural movement of the 60s and 70s. And during the decade the Freaks were together, they amassed an archive of 1,400 raw tapes and edits, mostly on half-inch open reel tape, which is a huge amount of tape for that time. In 2001, VDB took responsibility for this mammoth archive, gathering the tapes from various members' attics and cellars, cataloguing them, and then driving them in boxes to our offices in Chicago, right across the street here. In 2006, we signed a working contract with the Video Freaks, and since that time, we've dedicated considerable time and resources and energy to preserving and digitizing important examples of the work and making them accessible. As you can imagine, this has not been simple. Like, to give you an idea of what it really means to preserve video from that time, early attempts to raise funding for the project were unsuccessful. So we developed a sort of ad hoc methods to begin preservation. We couldn't even play these tapes. We didn't have decks to play the half-inch open reel tapes, so we couldn't see. We still can't see what's on a lot of the tapes. So we knew we had to get some of them preserved and transferred to videos we could play. But at that time, you had to send them off-site to a specialist video house, and it cost $400 a tape. So we published a list of titles and put that on the website. I mean, titles like, you know, John Goes Down the Tunnel, or they were very obscure, written on the tape labels. And on the basis of that list, probably around 20 or so individuals approached us to preserve some videotapes. So for their $400, they each received a DVD, and we received a restored master. So that was the beginning. And it's only been over the last 6 or so years that we've been able to make significant headway on preserving the archive. The School of the Art Institute supported the hiring of a digitisation specialist, Christine McDonough, who's actually one of the organisers of this event, who's at the back there. And Kristen was with us for 3 years, and with her help we were able to build an early video preservation suite, mainly by sourcing obsolete decks and other equipment from eBay, video specialists and friends, colleagues. So in the beginning, as we sought ways to prioritise preservation efforts, we searched for clues about the tapes. We asked each of the freaks to give us their top 10 list. What were the ones they remembered and particularly thought were important? Maybe 3 of them responded to that, so that wasn't so successful. We talked to them about their memories about some of the tapes, and sometimes they had really conflicting memories about what was on the tapes, which was interesting. Between them, they've published several memoirs, and we still really look at those and try and identify what might be on certain tapes. And when Kristen was digitizing the tape, she was able to take notes of some. I mean, she was doing this in real time, so she couldn't take notes on everything. But some things that were outstanding, she was able to, note for us. So we continue to piece this information together in order to decide which tapes to prioritize for preservation. Some of the 1,400 tapes are duplicates, some have been recorded over multiple times and include sections taped from TV news and other broadcasts. To date, we've probably digitized about 80%. And the work doesn't stop there. Once we do preserve and digitize a tape, they have to be viewed, we have to have descriptions written, promotional clips and images are made, we decide upon search tags, and then they're entered into our database and into distribution, and then they're available for circulation. So even now, some 18 years after we first started talking to the video freaks about this project, only around 100 titles are in distribution, with another 50 soon to be added. So we've done a lot of work more recently. Work continues, and none of this would have been possible without the dedication of VDB staff, past and present, and particularly Tom Colley, who's our archive and collections manager, who's not here today, unfortunately, but who has done a lot of work with this archive. So for me, there's a lot of questions to think about with this kind of endeavour, and I'm looking forward to, talking more. But first, I'm going to show 2 short video clips from the Video Freaks archive. They're very different, and it just says a little bit about the breadth of the collection. The first one's called Mise and Use. It's from 1971, and the tape is actually 4 minutes long, but this is a 1-minute excerpt. It's a kind of exuberant image processing tape. And it's the first time I've ever seen morphine on video, so that's from 71. And the second piece is a really important, extraordinary interview recorded with Fred Hampton in the house of a wealthy Chicago woman named Lucy Montgomery. And it's really prescient and was shot less than 2 months before Fred Hampton was killed by the Chicago police. So thank you. I'm sorry, there should be sound on this.
You and the people around you seem to be like always in danger. You know, you could be killed as you walked out of here, because this happened to a lot of people in the Black Panthers and all the black movements. And like, can you be sure that your movement, are you strong enough now, you know, that are you going to go on? Is the Black Panthers, if you go, if you are killed, will the breakfast program go on just on a, you know, day-to-day type level?
Well, last year we started 3 Breakfast for Children program. This year we gave those 3 to the people, and they're running those Breakfast for Children already.
The people are.
Right. And our whole program is geared toward educating the mass of the people. And that free health clinic that we have, the people in the community are going to run that clinic. And after a while, we're going to give them that clinic, and we're going to move on to higher levels, because we understand the difference between the vanguard and the people. We're not going to practice imperialism. We're going to keep out there setting up some new examples, some new revolutionary programs that the people can basically relate to, because basically people are progressive and basically people are revolutionary. We're not worried about them killing anybody, because I think that, you know, they jailed Huey P. Newton, and they ran Cleve out the country, Elbridge Cleve out the country, and they jailed Bobby Seale, and we got David Head up there now, who's very capable, most capable of running the Black Panther Party, and they can just take all of them they want to. We're always going to have someone to fulfill that position, because that's the type of organization the Black Panther Party is. We don't produce buffoons, we produce leaders.
Thank you, yeah. Incredibly powerful film. And finally, Liz. Liz, you have roots in Bulgaria, Germany, Russia, and London. And your work has really revolved around the communities where you've lived. And at the same time, you've also done editorial work for magazines like ID and The Face, and the entirety of that work has formed the basis for your ongoing project called the Black Balloon Archive, which continues to be the source for your work. When you and I spoke a few months ago, you said that I cannot archive for myself, I must archive for others, which I thought was really telling about your practice. So can you tell us about your process for making work and your relationship to the source of your work, your own community, as well as the institutions in which that work now lives?
Yes, hello. Thank you for inviting me. I know it's snowy and too much for some, but for me, this is exciting to see Chicago in snow. I guess I have to start where I started. And where I started, I didn't think of archives. I just found photography and found through photography a tool to, I suppose, approach people that I was interested in. And because you mentioned my background, where I came from, it was a place where I just didn't have any access to Black communities. So kind of coinciding with discovering photography and coming, let's say, to New York for the first time, I experienced that actually through photography I could get close to people. And for me, that was just a ride that I took. So there was no idea about this is going to be an archive, this is going to... I started doing this, and I think after about 10 years, I suddenly thought, I have so much, I need to find some kind of, I would say, not so much finding sense, but finding something that holds things together. Because my archive is first of all, photographic. So I had all these, and it's analog as well. So I had just all these things around me growing and growing. But I also had more and more sort of this need to go everywhere and to document everyone. And I think the idea to call it an archive was, it came kind of about, sometimes when I go out and photograph people, they ask me why. Not always. A lot of times people just let me. But when they ask me why, then I have to come up and say why. And I remember there was a moment where I said, well, I want your picture because I will keep it in good company. And it was just a rap at the moment, thinking this is, it makes sense. But it made sense to the person that I told it to, and I took the picture. And I think from then on, I started thinking that what I do is primarily, I guess it started from my own need. But when I take a picture, I also take it because I'd like the person that I photograph to feel that it makes sense that I photograph them and that I don't just take. So I wanted a space that is safe. I wanted a space that is what I consider democratic. So I kind of tried to relate to my work that there is no hierarchy. I've worked with all kinds of people, but for me, it's all the same. So there's that approach. And I thought I'd call it an archive because an archive is something that, for me, as I see it, is something that preserves things and at the same time keeps them important as well. And I wanted to preserve something that for me was very important, which was the everyday, because I don't really go out of my way to find exotic locations. I do my work wherever I am because I find the people that I want to photograph wherever I am. So in a way, that's how my archive grew. And as I said, it is an archive that is, to start with, a photographic one. But I think doing photography, eventually you stumble across video. You stumble across the fact that no matter what I see, what I hear is equally important. So I started to film things as well. And I think what I tried to keep in my archive is a certain kind of non-linear movement. I tried to avoid any kind of reference about place and time, because I always felt that place and time in connection with the communities that I photograph is really a place to put them in place. So, because it's my archive, I decided to abolish this. So for me, when people look at my work, they have to confront the person. They might try to guess where and when, but they have to just rely on what they see. And when I started doing video work, it was something where, I don't know if I should. So it has a lot to do for me also with accessibility, because the reason why I did my archive is because I wanted to have access to it. And not just access, I also wanted the work to be a representative of how I feel about the lack of representation. And I think in a certain way, when I show work, I try to make that point as well. So in a certain way, I'm trying to get away from any kind of institutional representation. So whenever I show in a museum, that's the first hurdle for the museum to deal with. And personally, I think it's something that, I guess, through showing my work in spaces, I realized it's the only way to actually bring the people that I photograph in. Because I don't work in clean spaces, I don't work in sort of, I don't work in linear spaces. I walk around and I see and I approach and I ask. So this show that I did this summer was very much about creating a space. And the space that I created was also there so it could be animated. So I had other artists doing performances in here, responding to the work, but I don't expect people to respond to my work. I just use my work as, sometimes in this case, as this kind of sculptural backdrop. I also sort of feel that trying to break down the idea of how to order things is for me very important, because it's something that whenever I come into an institution, I have to struggle with. You know, I just came back from New York and I went to the MoMA because everyone said, oh, it's such a wonderful place, and I'm sure it is. But it's not so wonderful for everyone, you know? Like for me, I walked in and after half an hour I walked out because I just couldn't relate to how art is presented. And I think that's the first step, how you keep people out of places. So when I show, I try to have also something that is very difficult for institutions, engagement, you know? I try to make pieces that people can actually touch, which is a no-no in institutions. But in my archive is a must because I engage with my archive physically. The video, I just say quickly something to the video, is something that came about because I had access to an archive, the Black Cultural Archive, which is an institution in South London, in Brixton, and they collect mainly anything that is connected to, let's say, the Windrush generation. And they had a collection of interviews of women. And I went to the archive, I took some interviews out of the archive from women. So I wanted female voices. And then I thought, oh, I need the man too. So I got the man from the radio because, you know, they are kind of more present in public. So I tried to mix my pictures with the words of the women and the words of the men. And this is an expert, I guess. There should be sound, because without sound it ain't working.
And there were a lot of, in those days, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there were a lot of men who were criminalised by racism. I remember going to this meeting at the West Indian Cultural Community Centre here. And I was late because I'd come from some women's meeting, and I remember going in and saying, no, I'm really sorry I'm late, but in this woman's meeting, and then this guy saying to me, you know what, sooner you're going to have to decide whether you is black or whether you is a woman. And I thought, well, that's not going to be easy.
You, pleased with yourself for freeing yourself, after seeing yourself in a world by yourself, not knowing yourself to question yourself about yourself that enslaved you.
In this world of trouble, a station come to me, speaking words of wisdom. Galaxy, 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 galaxy. Galaxy Radio, a free station.
No love, one spirit of you moja, ain't you know?
You ask me if I have ever been to prison. Been to prison? Your world of murderers and thieves, of hatred and jealousy, of death. And you ask me if I have ever been to prison. I answer, yes, I am still there trying to escape.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for those great introductions. I think in picking up on the idea with Liz's work that the work is never fixed. It's constantly changing. You're drawing from a range of sources, a range of material, pirate radio, Black cultural archives, and we've seen ways in which you're all drawing work from vernacular sources, to use that very problematic term broadly. And so what I'm wondering, maybe we could loop back to you, Jacqueline, is how do you retain fidelity to the original? How do you interpret material when you might not know its origin?
Yeah, we do have some material and we don't know the origin. So I guess I think about when I was talking about the history of relations to the camera, I guess, I really think about the archive that we have not just as the material archive, but as an archive of a practice. And so it's challenging now to retain the fidelity of like the original presentational situation. So we often show stuff like this, digital video, our digital copies, but wherever we can, we also try to we put a projector in the middle of the room and we run the sound of the projector, and even, you know, it looks worse depending on the throw and so forth. So the fact that we really try to more generally encourage people not to throw the originals away, even if they let us digitize stuff and they want it back, totally respect that. But just sort of emphasizing all the time that the uniqueness of the material thing they have will always be the thing to go back to if you want to transfer it 10 years from now or 30 years from now or whatever. That's one way we think about the fidelity, I guess, it's the original. And then it's about also the kind of presentational context. That's why it's so important for us to have the families there as often as we can to provide the soundtrack, to do something close to, although obviously not the same as what they did in the basement when they would show these films over and over and over again. So it's both the, the material and the performative, I guess, are the two aspects of the original that we think about.
And
a lot.
I've heard you use the term also community cataloging for the ways in which you kind of obtain the information that eventually winds up in the archive as well. So again, going back to this notion of how the community informs what the archive is, you know, which is so integral to your practice as well, Liz. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned right now showing the clips on the screen, because one of the things that occurred to us as we're preparing the clips for presentation today is that it was actually appropriate, it was okay to show all three of these clips in this setting on the screen with this projection. And that's something that's really interesting about and thinking about the video data bank. What occurs to me is that many of the films don't come with really specific criteria about hardware or about the space that they can be shown. They really are, you know, kind of, they can adapt to the environment. So can you speak a little bit about, you know, what is the criteria that, or how do you determine the criteria for preservation presentation?
Right. Well, it's interesting because we do try and inform and educate. We're mainly dealing with institutional users, so universities, libraries, festivals, museums are the main. You will sometimes get an individual that rents a video to show in a screening space, but that's more on the rare side because our prices are institutional rates, because we're a not-for-profit and we don't have a lot of money, and we pay royalties to the artist twice a year. Artists get 50% of the income, so it's a source of income for artists. That's important to say. And for instance, with the Video Freaks, all the income, the Video Freaks get 50%, but the other 50% that we get goes completely back into preservation. Way more than the 50%, in fact. But so when we think about presentation, we really do try and educate people actually to show like work from the 70s on a you know, an old monitor and not on a you know, new television. Like we have that on our website, and we do talk to exhibitors about how they show work. And sometimes, but we're not there. You know, it can be shown. You know, we sell like to a museum in Spain. We're not in the room seeing how they're projecting it, but we do. Sometimes people will tell us, "Oh, I was there, and they didn't have the sound on." So we will contact them and say, you know, that really should show with sound. When it comes to something like the Video Freaks, it's so interesting, and with more and more work now actually, because, for instance, we've preserved these tapes, and then one of the Video Freaks came to Chicago and put all the works we preserved on a hard drive, and he has remixed them and put them on his website, which is fantastic. You know, they're their tapes, and he's reinterpreting their work, but it's on a website, so the quality of that image is completely different from the originals. And even here, it didn't show as well as I've seen it show, but you know, so we don't try and control that, but we do try and help things be shown in the best possible way where we can.
And you've mentioned certain instances where artists have actually created works especially for the video data bank, specifically to meet your criteria, which I found really interesting.
Yes, I don't remember saying that, but I can't think of an example of that, so
Yeah.
maybe that was a misunderstanding. I'm sorry.
Well, you were saying how, because the works exist in an unlimited edition in some cases,
Yes.
and...
In all cases.
Yeah.
Like, we're very proud that the works we distribute are unlimited edition. So we work with a lot of very well-known artists like Bruce Nauman, Martha Rosler, Yvonne Rayner, and their work is, we make their work available to anybody that wants to show them. We don't work with limited edition at all. But we continue to work with contemporary artists. We've just taken some work on now. The last Whitney Biennial, we had a lot of our artists showed in the moving image section there. So we continue to collect. But I'm also interested in this idea of like what gets collected and who is deciding on this. And, I think these things are also very interesting. So I think for both of you, your criteria, like for you, it's like you have this geographical, South Chicago specific is really kind of great. Like that makes you think, wow, that's something manageable or semi-manageable. And yours is so personal in many ways. And I think when the video data bank began, I would say there were very few video artists. They probably mostly knew each other. Whereas now, many artists who work in different forms, video is a part of their practice. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot more difficult. We talk about it as like we collect works that speak to the collection, which I don't like that phrase, but it's hard to find another way of saying it.
So to loop back to this idea of community, Liz, can you talk a little bit more, because some of you, the sources for your work is your own work, but you've also mentioned the Black Cultural Archive and the pirate radio clip that we heard in this last video. Can you talk a little bit about how this work kind of loops back to the community? Have you shown the work back within the communities that you've created them? For example, at the Black Cultural Archive, how does this work relate to that?
I have. In a certain way, I have to say, one reason I have an archive is because I want to have my own control. And for that, I produce my own pictures. So the archive really exists of the pictures that I take or the videos that I do, because I suppose I want to be, in a certain way, ownership is very important for me as a reference to what I do, because I suppose in a certain way I grew up with second-hand references. So now, for me, it's very important that the moment that you see is one where I can give you reference to. But when it comes to showing, it's very interesting because I've worked more or less doing my thing and not really considering others, in the sense of the way I work. It's very hard for me to take a picture and show you the picture. And then it's very hard to connect again and, just to give back, really. But I think, like the project with the Black Cultural Archive, what we did was, why I did this video as well, is because they have a wall in Brixton, in the center of Brixton. So that's why I put it together, because I thought people will pass by. It's just a thing of how to get people. And in a way, what I try to do is, like the show that I did in the South London Gallery, I wanted that show because I knew the people that are in the pictures will be able to come and see it. And it's not a thing of me working hard to reach people. I think I need, whenever I get into an institution, then I have a chance to go out and bring people in. Like, I make cards and then I go onto the high street and hand them out. It's a very hand-to-hand thing. I don't really try to become an institution. This is something where, that's why my archive also represents a certain way of how I like to be in a certain chaos. It's how I find my things. It's my resource for artwork that I want to do. And I think all those back and forth things, but also, and I suppose through showing my work, I suddenly found a way of getting the people that I want to see the work, that I want to see themselves or their community. So for me, it's always been a thing of being part of the community. It's not something where I go to a certain place. I mean, even when I come to America, I'm not from here, but once you start talking to people, you talk to people. It's not a matter of approaching strangers. So my work is really, in many ways, it functions on many levels. And the idea of an archive is, for me, mainly to take it serious and to keep it safe and to preserve it.
And what's interesting about what you mentioned in your introduction is that, yes, you've constructed the archive, but you also make sure that each of your exhibitions, you create a space for the work. You know, the work doesn't just exist in the space, it's a space created by the work.
Yeah, I think what is important for me is that really it's a space that I feel I can invite people in. And I can let them wander around and find their own thing, because the relevance, for a long time I thought the only relevance there is mine. But, you know, well, it's not, because otherwise people wouldn't let me take their picture. So the relevance is there as soon as the image happens. But the relevance that I want to pass on as well is of preservation, of importance. And I think through my artwork, I'm trying to, try to show that. And it's on a very sort of one-to-one level. You know, sometimes I use material to print my pictures. Simply when you see it, you think, what does it feel like? And that element for me is very important, because I think when you work in a visual kind of context, it's important to make associations with all kind of senses, because as a human being, we do use all these senses. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, the idea of creating space. And so in this respect, I'm also wondering, Jacqueline, because you've spoken about screening these films within the community and showing it to community, what are your thoughts about the uses of this film beyond and other kinds of institutional spaces, and how do you determine the appropriate uses and permissions for this kind of work?
Yes. Yeah, these layers of the institutional caretaking or administration are so thorny. And for the first 5, 6 years of the project, I wasn't collecting the material. I was asking people to show it to me, and then I said, oh, I'll invite you to come and show it, and you show. So it was more about the presentation. And then in talking to more and more archivists who work in the field, they really were convincing about how ephemeral this material is, and that if there aren't some mechanisms for collecting some of it, that younger generations get rid of this stuff, and then how will we see it, and that kind of thing. So then I had to start building an infrastructure for taking it in, and there are deeds of gift, right? And then when people want to show, like when Nike wants to use some of the material, it's like, So yeah, we really talk to we go back to the families. If there's material people see that they want to use, we go back and we talk to the families about this is the use they're thinking about. And some of the families, I have not gotten any huge financial offers for any of this material. We studied what other archives charge as for licensing fees and that kind of thing, and we tried to come up with something similar, a little lower. Well, we would charge Nike more. People who could pay more should pay more.
I would expect so.
But we share whatever we get with the donor families, and we talk to them a lot about how it is that the symbiotic relationship that we have, which is so complicated, right? Like Nike wouldn't know about these Black home movies were it not for the project, but the project wouldn't exist if people didn't donate their material. So we really, one reason I haven't been pushing to really take in as much as possible is because so much of what we're doing is kind of testing these relationships and these conversations. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that this is a project that, is building a body of material that people can use and look at for all kinds of reasons, but also that it's just sort of an experiment in how to do this kind of archival project. And to have conversations exactly like this, right. To think about what it means to try to formalize and share material, which, as you said in your introduction, was not intended to be shown beyond family context.
And it's also kind of transformed the second that you let it enter into an archive. So it's very interesting what happens to a work if Nike uses it versus if it's shown in a museum, and how that might transform the work long term, and what that means for the work itself and how it was originally conceived. Abina, in terms of your work, I'm curious about how technological shifts have affected not just the work itself, but also the mission and goals of the VDB, and how that has maybe affected some of the criteria that you're considering for not just presentation, but also preservation.
Oh, that's really complicated because, yeah, for an organisation like us, which, it doesn't have a lot of money, every time there's been a technological shift, there's fear runs through the organisation. For instance, I mean, I've been there 20 years, and I remember, it seems ridiculous now, but when DVDs became a thing, like for 20 years, video was all about Betacam and VHS, and we had that down, and 3/4 inch. When DVDs came around, we didn't have the money to. We had probably then 5,000 titles. It's a lot of videotapes, and we had to think about. We had to think about how do we convert everything to DVD, and it probably took 5 years for us to be able to afford to start doing that. And we do it like what's the most popular orders? Sadie Benin, Martha Rosler, and they're the ones we digitized first. But that was the first type of digitization. We had to go back and do everything again with the streaming that's coming. Streaming is the next. And streaming's a good. Like we raised some money from the National Endowment for the Arts to upgrade our website to be able to stream, and now we're trying to. Have the School of the Art Institute help us actually build the streaming. But that's been a very long project that's developing. Hopefully it will happen soon. But so we have to wait a lot, and it's very it makes you very insecure when you're waiting and the whole world seems to be moving on. But in another way, I feel like for us it's kind of good, because by the time we're able to do something, a lot of the artists are feeling okay about it. Like when DVD technology came around, several of our artists wouldn't refuse to have their work available on DVD because, it did look crap. It was an ugly technology, an ugly moment in many ways. And so by the time things developed enough for us to be able to work with it, they felt better. They felt more secure. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, and to be digitizing something like the Video Freaks archive is there's so many strange. Right. But one thing I do believe is that streaming might well really help us make work more accessible, because we're always struggling to find a way to have work available to a wider audience. If you go to small towns and show work and people say, well, how can I see more? That's the frustration of our organisation. And so I think there's possibilities there for making work more accessible.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I want to say something to this, because for me that's very interesting, because one of the elements that I love about my ability, saying this is mine, is to work with fragility. So I use a lot of fragility in my work when I show my work. And it's I guess, also a way of not being against an institution, but maybe to remind people of the fragility of something, no matter how much we archive it, the technology changes, whatever changes. So I think on one side, it's this thing of trying to hold on to everything, but also to remind that it's very fragile. Yeah. You can't hold on to everything. It's still a physical entity. Yeah. Yes, and as an artist, that's exciting. I wouldn't want to do it on your side, because that's probably more challenging. Yeah.
So we have just a few minutes left, and before we turn it over to questions, I'm kind of curious, and I'll start with you, Liz, about what ambitions do you have for your own archive? And I'm hoping each of you could answer that question that you hope to realize for your archive.
Well, I just mentioned fragility, but I do want it to survive. And I think it's something that's coming through the time that I've been engaging with it, and also to sort of like I had to move my studio after 25 years. And as I said, my archive is analog, it's physical. So there was a thing of opening boxes that I haven't opened for years and realizing, because I move on. I call it an archive, but it's a living archive. So it's not something where I constantly go back. And I think because I started showing him, because I also hear from people, they think it's important to them, you know. So I do want my archive to survive, but I also know that as an artist, I'm not the one who can preserve it. I'm very conscious of that, because A, it's a money thing, B, it's a job that I just would not want to do, because it would take me away from what I want to do. So archiving is, I'd like my archive to survive. I can say that. How? Ideally the way I like it, but I know it won't, you know, because for anyone else to handle it, it would be difficult. So I guess I have to learn to maybe deal with compromises, or maybe finding a way of, working it out. But I do want it to survive, yes.
Bina.
Same question?
Yeah.
Oh, so can you just...
But what are the ambitions? What do you hope to achieve with the archive? Or what are some of the ambitions that you haven't been yet able to fulfill?
Oh, so many. I think there are so many, because we're in an institution, you're somewhat at the, you're what's happening in the institution, like they're going to, developments there will dictate somewhat what Video Data Bank is able to do. So my ambitions, I think broadly, are that the collection survive somehow, and that things will happen with it that I can't even envisage. And for me, what I think about is 6,000 titles. There are a lot of those titles that aren't by people that became famous, many of them women. And I love the idea that a student somewhere will be able to dive into the collection, probably in their bedroom, because they'll be streaming, and they'll find something amazing, and something will happen that will inspire them to make a piece of art themselves, or they will want to contact the artist. That's my real ambition for our collection, is that a million things will happen. And I mean, in my life, art has completely changed my life and inspired me, and I want that to happen over and again.
And I think it's important to mention that you don't just have work by artists, you also have work about artists. And your
Yes.
collection also
Yeah.
includes a lot of artist interviews, and it's just as a resource. And it'll be interesting to see how those videos will get used in the future, and how that might be similar or different use. How does that divide up, and how will those evolve over time and get adapted into various uses over time?
Exactly. Because I do think that that we have this on Art and Artist collection of interviews that go back to the late 60s. And I thinking of both your archives, that what I love about those interviews, especially the early ones, is they're unmediated. Now we're also used to being interviewed or talking on camera or being on camera. We pose a little bit, Instagram pose. And so what I love about these interviews is mainly women are being asked about their art practice. And there's a moment in so many of those videos where the subject is like, oh, you really want to know why I paint this squiggle on everything? And they just light up. And I think making those kinds of works, and I think that's a lot of what you have, and probably what you're making, are these unmediated images. That's so interesting.
I certainly want, as a scholar, for this material to be taken seriously within the history and the theories of the moving image. I'm hoping that this is material that will be really widely used. I love the way you describe uses that we can't even imagine, because I think that's so important. And it ties to that longevity aspiration. So we are kind of imagining that there is a future in which people will want to use it. So we're always working in kind of multiple temporalities, I guess. But I've been thinking a lot, too, about about new technologies and about how to make this archive sort of available to people as they're circulating in the spaces of the Southside now and in the future, like if it's some app or something. I don't know what it is, but there's so much change happening, radical change to the physical spaces of the Southside, that I think this is an archive that can really help people to see how other people have navigated and created those spaces over time. And so to imagine that someone can stand at the corner of 63rd and Cottage Grove and they can pull up an image that is 63rd and Cottage Grove 40 years from before, 50 years before. And that can somehow not just help with whatever historical projects or even urban design, but make people in neighborhoods feel as though they have a kind of anchor, that they are something that they can relate to in terms of the everyday experiences that people had in the past. I think that moving images, and especially these home movies, have a way of creating that sense of connection and helping people to feel as though they belong where they are.
And it seems like the common thread is, again, creating spaces and creating these communities around these works of film. So I think we have just a few minutes left. If anybody has any questions, happy to take them. Anyone? Not any questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for bringing everybody together, Mahal. I love this kind of idea that you brought out of thinking about these works that were never intended to be used within institutions or public. And my question really is for Jacqueline. And the question is, this is a little bit nitty-gritty, but in your deed of gift language, do you have sort of baked-in language in there that sort of releases you to be able to view these works in different settings, or in being really sort of conscientious stewards of this material, and especially with families and with donors who might be more skeptical of institutions on the South Side, like the University of Chicago? Do you then have that conversation? Do you talk with the donors every time there's a sort of licensing opportunity, be it, in a nonprofit museum for an exhibition or more commercial purposes like Nike?
So our basic deed of gift asks them for everything.
That's great.
And then we say, here's the thing that asks for everything. Everything here is negotiable. And then usually somebody's nephew really looked at it. It's like, you're going to sign that. And then we negotiate with them. And our agreements don't say that we have to consult in every case for use, but we do, because it just seems like the right thing to do. I think one of the challenges that I know that one of the challenges that similar projects have faced is that as people pass away who sign the document, then when someone wants to use the material, then it's impossible to share it in certain forms. And so we didn't want to be caught in that situation. But we're always mindful of the fact that this is a weird thing to present to people. I'm sure the look on my face when I hand it to them is almost pointing to the place, like, please read that paragraph. And I think that totally echoes my own very personal relationship to my institution, because I am a Black woman from the South Side of Chicago working at the University of Chicago. So this kind of code switching and this liminal existence infuses the project and really guides all the ways that I interact with people in performing the project.
I'm curious on that same thread, if anybody's ever brought up issues about the method of presentation and the idea that you are transferring it to digital and that it might be shown in really different ways. Has that ever come up?
No, they don't care. Okay. Because not yet, no one has cared. Because people may have the films, but they never have projectors that work, if they have projectors at all. So they are very moved to see the footage. So the transferring, we sometimes will, we have to make sure that we can project things if they're not too shrunken. But there have been some cases in which people are nervous because they haven't seen it, like, well, what's on it? Am I going to be naked, 5 years old in the bathtub? And yeah, they are, yeah. So sometimes we project a few reels, but we always ask, is it okay to present? We don't just take things and make them public. We make sure that people are comfortable with what we're presenting. And in a few cases, we have material that they've allowed us to digitize, but we have not made it public. So,
because they read the paragraph.
Because they read the paragraph, right.
Just to say, that's actually the same with the Video Freaks tape. So there are some tapes that we've digitized where somebody that was in the tape has seen the tape and said, no, I don't want that made available. So it doesn't go into distribution.
And then just to follow up with this, with a similar question, you know, some of this original videos were meant to be shown on television, you know, as a public television. So then are there certain restrictions that they're thinking about in terms of how then it's shown or where it's shown, or are they?
Well, we have a contract that with our artists that they everybody gets a contract, and it's the same thing. There's negotiation around different. Some people don't want their work sold to a museum, for instance. They have a gallery that does that, or there's different permutations. But that doesn't come up so much because in the contract we tend to say we'll make the best possible copy. We have best practices that hopefully our artists trust that we are enacting all the time. So that doesn't come up too much. But everything does happen. Anything that could happen if an artist will request, and we always agree. Yeah, it's their work. Right. And so it's not our work, and that's really important to state that, you know, it's not our work. We are just we're just taking care of it for a while, or for as long as the artist wants us to. And it's a big question for us coming up because so many video artists are now reaching their, you know, 70s and 80s, and people are starting to pass away, and we're already dealing with a few estates and trustees, and they can be very different animals to deal with. And yeah, it's going to be interesting times coming up.
Yeah. We have one last question, or no takers? Okay. Oh, wait, I see one hand in the back.
Hi, thank you to all of you for your presentations. And I wanted to thank particularly Abina and Jackie for pointing out, as Abina mentioned, the layers of the labor involved in making these things available. And there's one more layer I wondered if you could speak to it a little bit, and that is like once something is streaming or online, it's only as findable as well as it is described. So I'm wondering if you could talk about descriptive languages that you use in order to help things become more discoverable.
You mentioned the community cataloging, so I really want to take advantage of the fact that Southside audiences talk a lot during screenings of all kinds. So we're collecting information at our screenings. We have these small-scale community cataloging events where we might sit at a table with 3 or 4 elders and show them some stuff. And so we have created a catalog that is really customized to our collections. Has time, place, all of the structure stuff you spoke against. And then it also has trees, babies, Coke cans, like things student workers, you know, interns have identified in the films, a shoot shot from a moving car. I mean, we're listening for the kinds that we're trying to listen for the kinds of things we think Southsiders want to see in the footage, and then echo that in the catalog descriptions. So it's really granular because the content of these films is so granular. And that's like a project that will never end, and that's something that I really love about what we're attempting to do in terms of our description.
I think for us, our last database that runs our website, it's kind of outdated now, and we didn't ever have enough money to have a really good tagging system. So we have quite a basic tagging system right now. So we're so excited to get a new website where we can tag more and have maybe artists can tag their own work or people can cross tag. So I think the tagging thing is really important. In terms of writing, like when we take on an artist's work, they often send us a description, and we use that. We also like to write something where there's a kind of house style, I guess, that we tend to write in that's about making it more visible. Like often artists will write 3 or 4 lines that it's like a poem, but it doesn't tell you an awful lot about the actual video. So we tend to do that. But then I love it when you start seeing writing about work, and we always add links to writing because it just expands the kind of like understanding of the piece.
All right, thank you all. I think we unfortunately have to wrap up, but thank you to the three of you.
Welcome to the second panel of our Time-Based Media Symposium. My name is Solveig Nelson. I'm the Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow in Time-Based Media, and I am co-chairing the second panel entitled Imagining Futures, Reformatting and Reconstructions with my colleague Robin Farrell, who will be joining after our introductory 30-minute interview between myself and artist Beryl Korot. And we wanted to break up the kind of format of the panels and shift to a little bit more of an informal mode, and also one that allows us to talk a little with Beryl about, what her thoughts are about process, to kind of bracket kind of our own academic conservation language, and to start from the position of an artist who's been thinking about similar concerns, but with her own language and her own works for decades. So we were thrilled that Beryl could join us. As many of you know, she's an innovator in video, but not only in the sense that she created her own incredibly influential works, but that she created space for other artists that I hope that we'll talk about in a few moments. She created early multi-channel video installations, such as Dachau 1974 and Text and Commentary in 1977, that have recently been acquired into the collections of MoMA, of the Cramlet Collection, SF MoMA, Tate MoMA, and Tate and the Toma Foundation here in Chicago. And her simultaneous practices in print media, in video, and in weaving have played out in very different ways throughout her decades of practice. Her early works are things that she's come back to recently in new ways, and that's something that maybe forms a dialogue with the panel that will continue with Ina, Maurice, and Phil. But I first wanted to just start with a slide from Radical Software, number 1, which Beryl, you co-founded and were instrumental in. And I was reading a second publication that you made, the anthology called Video Art from 1976. Is your mic on? That would be key question number 1.
It's on.
Excellent. And you were talking a little bit in this 1976 anthology, in which you published an incredible number of artist statements and artist diagrams and installation shots. You were looking back at Radical Software, and what struck me is this combination of terms that you used. On the one hand, a publication that could be a conduit for information, that was also a space for artists' philosophies, for artists, the idea that artists had their own philosophies and that you were creating a space for them, and that there were so few outlets for distribution and exhibition that in a way the print and that those pages became a site that people were sharing their work that weren't necessarily able to share it in other ways. And I thought that that was a really exciting, complex layer of ambitions, and I wanted to hear a little bit about your own thoughts about your work, your kind of early work with print media.
Right, well, I actually, right out of college, I got a job at the New York Review of Books, and I was living in downtown Manhattan in the late 60s when the Portapak first came out, the Sony Portapak, which generated an unbelievable amount of excitement among all kinds of artists and filmmakers. Finally, you had something that was portable. You didn't have to go out with a big crew. You had your instant feedback. It was magnetic. It was something very new. I was part of a collective at that time called Rain Dance, which was a play on words of the Rand Corporation. It was kind of thumbing our nose at the military-industrial complex. And our attitude, in a sense, at that time was to liberate, with this new technology, video, the information environment from broadcast television. Because broadcast television in the 60s and news media were the main way that people got their information. So Radical Software came, I had a co-editor, Phyllis Segura, and we sent out a questionnaire to everyone we knew anywhere who was working in this new medium, and just about everybody wrote back to us because there was such a need for people to communicate. And at that time, though we were thinking of information exchanges through the videos that people were actually making, it was, people really didn't know where to send things or how to organize it. So Radical Software, in a sense, became the conduit for all of this kind of information. And soon after doing Radical Software, I also did this book with Ira Schneider called Video Art, which also invited a huge number of artists to submit 2-page spreads on their work, and also invited people who were beginning to think about the video medium to submit their ideas. I guess at the time, the idea, 2 of the catchwords, which now apply to what's going on the internet, were decentralization and access, and that was really important to us.
And so you were publishing works, in some cases, or notations or text of works that hadn't been made yet, that were still in the process of being conceptualized in some cases. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, whatever an artist sent us, we published.
Got it.
That there was no particular censorship in that sense. If we invited you, you had your 2 pages. So there was all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's a very interesting archive if you go back and look at Video Art or Radical Software, where people were also trying to help one another. I mean, it was also things about what's the information environment that we're living in. It wasn't kind of like an information delivery system that we've been living with the internet. It was what's the actual information environment that's nourishing us. Now that's a question that's becoming much more common now. People are beginning to question more, but that was what was going on at the time.
If we could go to the next slide. So I adore this image. I'm going to grab the slide cue so I don't have to do that. Beryl, that you sent this image of yourself working with one of your first multi-channel video installations, Dachau, is that correct?
Yeah, well, actually, I was teaching a class at Broward College in Florida. And if I were presenting this work, there was a video wall. The monitors that you see here were punched into the wall, and all of that paraphernalia that you see was behind the wall. And if you were going to present this piece in a museum, and it was presented very early in a museum, it meant that the curators or the people in the gallery space or the presentation space, wherever that was, had to put the reel-to-reel, the 4 reel-to-reel, had to thread the 4 decks. There was an X that I marked at a certain place, and at a certain time, there were 4 levers, and they went like this, boom, boom, and the tapes would roll, and after 30 minutes, they'd have to go back, rewind the tape. There was no automated system at all, and that was the early days of presenting video work.
And you were demonstrating this in a class?
I was talking about this particular work to a class, and this is what the man who had invited me to talk about this work, this was the necessary equipment. So this is what, and this was all, this was portable. I mean, even the portable, lightweight Sony deck that they came out with in the mid-'60s is not very portable. I still have my original deck, and it's heavy as hell. And, it's amazing that we felt so liberated. But it had sync sound, so that was a big deal.
I mean, it's amazing to look at this as, an artist is asked to show their work in a classroom setting.
And you
or
can also reuse it. I mean,
you
the
have the
tape,
whole setup, right?
Yeah. Well, people shared equipment a lot then, too. You had these collectives, like the Video Freaks that Abina was talking about. And one of the reasons that a lot of people got together was to share this equipment. So,
and you know, and that women were teaching each other about this equipment was also a kind of a radical break from what often happens.
I would say that in the downtown scene in New York, which is what I was familiar with, filmmakers, sculptors, painters, dancers, it was a really close community of artists. There weren't as many artists as there are now. You didn't have the proliferation of art schools that you have now. And people were really they knew one another. They were neighbors and they were sharing. It was a very intimate, very special time.
I also want to go back to what you were saying about, and look at another image from this installation, to think about this decision to put the monitors in the walls, which can appear very clean, and then to think about this whole other part of the work that the viewer would not encounter, but this whole performance that was happening kind of behind the scenes of the work that comes out in this kind of an installation photograph.
Well, actually, at the time, I was also thinking that film, we were moving on from film. So here's the size of a film screen, but in this case, I was punching 4 holes into the screen. Part of the impetus of multiple channel work for me, too, which has, of course, become very common, was that it was taking people out of the broadcast television living room receivership and saying, if you want to see this work, you're going to have to come to a public space to see it. So that was, I felt, a very important thing. And at the beginning, I really didn't ever like to work with single channel at all, because I felt that part of the thrust of radical software was to really counter the forces that were out there and that could subsume your work. So it was to make things as difficult as possible.
I mean, I'm struck by when I read other artists at the time that are working with multi-channel, that there are really different theories of kind of what that brings, even though visually it might look similar in that you have stacks of monitors in different configurations. But, you know, everybody has a really different interpretation of what the conceptual stakes are of that.
Right. Well, in 1974, I found myself working with 3 media at the same time. One was radical software, which was a print medium, and we did everything ourselves. You know, somebody came down and taught from Time magazine. A friend of ours was working there and sent someone from the production department down and taught us how to spec type and make a magazine. And then also people assumed because I was working at the New York Review of Books, I knew how to do that. But of course I didn't. But the attitude at that time was that you could do anything you wanted to. There was just this tremendous openness. So print was one thing. Video was another. And then in 1974, a friend of mine said to me, who was a weaver, why don't you go to the Y on 50th Street and learn to weave? Because I was fascinated that the loom was the basis of abstract pattern, and that abstract pattern has as a basis a numerical structure. And I used to look at people on the subway and look at their coats, a twill pattern, and think, that person doesn't know they're wearing a 4-3-2-1 pattern on their back. And what occurred to me, and what was even more startling, was that in the loom, very ancient technology, in print and in video, more modern, all the information was encoded in lines. The very slow time encoding of information by the loom, the faster in print and how it's received by the brain and encoded in your head, and in video, how this invisible 525 lines per frame per second is encoding the information that you're shooting your camera at. And that relationship became the basis of my Dachau piece, in that the work on 4 channels was programmed according to a weaving structure. In order to have a basic piece of cloth, you need a 1, 3, 2, 4, over, under. Those two things will make any cloth. That's the basis of it. And in creating a narrative in the Dachau piece, I selected a series of images in a certain order, and for a period of time, interlocked them, like 1 and 3 would have the same information as 2 and 4, and varied. Each channel also had a rhythm, but it was the 1, 3, 2, 4 that cohered the work as it moved in time, and that was based on the reality of loom structure. And that took, in I guess 30 years, 40 years later, I got an email from a curator in Germany, Rika Frank, who invited me to be in a textile show. And I always considered Dachau to be my first textile work, but nobody ever understood what I was talking about. They always thought it was kind of an eccentricity I had, and that, you know, it was just something something personal to me, but not anything real in the world. And so when Rika wrote me and asked me to be in this exhibition, I read the email about 100 times. I couldn't believe that after so many years of talking about this, that somebody was actually putting me in a context that I felt really comfortable in with this multiple channel work.
I have up on the screen your notations and some stills from Dachau, and I wonder, you know, you were also about the choice of using these kind of pictographic diagrams of your video editing, which, sorry, it's right behind your head where you can't see it.
Right. Well, that also goes back to kind of the ancient and the modern and early language. I mean, my feeling about the loom actually is that it is, you know, we know now, everybody talks about it, that the root for the word text and weave are the same Latin root. But the actual, and fabric goes back for thousands of years. And the actual, you know, line by line is an expression of how we organize information in technology. So the first lines, in a sense, of text, in my belief, were on the loom. Then I got very interested in early language. I spent a lot of time when I was a kid in the Egyptian rooms of the Metropolitan Museum. And the whole relationship between sound and image and picture, how alphabets develop out of the pictures or art develops out of those early pictures, kind of almost like a turning point in which way you were going to go, became very important. So I was always interested in kind of making these analogies. Like, on the one hand, you're seeing the Dachau thing based on the loom. On the other hand, you're looking at what it would look like if it was a pictogram. So.
And you know, also your video footage being shot in '74. I mean, you're shooting it at the point in which the concentration camp is functioning as a site of memorial and tourism.
It was a tourist site. It was a tourist site, and I'd been invited to go to Germany to join my boyfriend, who was at the DAAD in Berlin, and I'd never been to Germany before. And it's hard to imagine now, but in 1974, nobody was talking about the Holocaust. The people who had gone through it were trying to survive and weren't ready yet to talk about it. And so if I was going to go to Germany, I felt like I had to go to a concentration camp. And this was their kind of pioneer concentration camp. This was their prototype concentration camp for political prisoners and all kinds of undesirables before they kind of institutionalized them. So when I got to Dachau, what struck me was that it was a tourist site, a really strange tourist site. So I very logically walked through the site and recorded it from outside the camp's walls to inside, from barracks far away to barracks close up, to families with children walking across a bridge that led to the crematoria, to mothers laughing with their kids while they played outside the crematoria, all very normal. And so there's nothing of the past in this work. It all exists through the placement of the architecture as it progresses, as the narrative is really taking you through the camp. There's no voiceover, and there's no imagery from the past. And it therefore rests in a lot of ways on memory and the fragility of memory, and how far away from this piece would you be before it doesn't make any sense at all. And I was very self-conscious at the time. There was an invitation I sent out to the show, and I did not write that this was Dachau. In like maybe 6-point or 8-point letters at the very top of the fringe, it just says Dachau 74. And, but people somehow got a feeling of where it was, and then they, oh my goodness, that's where it was. And it was the beginning of kind of a minimalist art in a way that took on very hot subject matter, you know.
Yeah, and this is another, we should be positioned in a different way, so I'm not asking you to like wring your neck every time I put something, but this was a notation for Dachau, correct?
Yeah, this was a notation, a second-by-second notation of the work. If you were lining up the channels to make it a little more interesting looking, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So each column, so that column is 2 minutes, or no, was it 3 minutes, and then 6 minutes, and 8 minutes, 12 minutes, 14 minutes, 16 minutes. That's part of the work, it's not the whole work. But I put this away in a drawer, and somebody asked me about 6 years ago if there was anything else I had notated of Dachau, and I found it in a folder, so.
And was this
there
notation you made for yourself, like in your process of making the work, or was
Yeah, I felt like, you know, there was a kind of, in doing something on Dachau, it also made you feel like the work of it. You know, there was that Arbeit macht frei, you know, work makes free. So it was kind of, as an artist, it was kind of like putting myself in that position of second by second, I'm laboring over this. You know, it was kind of had that, because there was the whole industrialization of horror that was also pioneered during that time.
So you were working with the different kinds, sort of multiple notions of technologies at once. Like even you know, it's not just about going from the technology of video to the technology of a kind of compositional structure or a notation structure, but also you were thinking about, you know, the kind of technologies.
Well, I was thinking of the technology of war.
Yeah, exactly.
At the time too.
Right.
I mean, not that you would ever know that by looking at that, but you know, yeah. Since you ask.
No. I think that that's a really important part of that process, actually, and the kind of hinging between things that like appear visually abstract, and then also have like they're either maps or sequences, they're codes. You know, they can be performed or linked to a particular political event, and we're always kind of hinging between those kinds of dimensions. So the fact that you were doing that in multiple ways within a given work, I think is interesting and kind of reappears in your next multi-channel work, Text and Commentary, which I'm showing the Castelli 1977 first exhibition, and then a recent exhibition at MoMA. And here's a little close-up. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this work, because
I guess in working with video and being screen-based very early on, I had a desire to break out from the screen and to be more tactile in making an image. And I already had done this Dachau piece where I had used the weaving analogy. So in this piece, I went a little further, and I had just learned to weave, and I decided I was going to create a dialogue between an ancient technology and a modern technology. And so I hung a camera from my studio. In my studio, I hung a camera above the loom while I was weaving, and just, you know, would bring the camera closer and closer to the threads or over my shoulder, and made a dialogue between the weaving and the video. And in exhibition, the video faces the weaving, and on the side walls, there are weaver's notations and pictograms. So, and each aspect of the exhibition in these different ways of expressing the same thing. So I was trying to say, how do you ever know anything by just one thing? So that was a question in the back of my mind when I was making this work.
I'm going to go to just a blank slide so that we can play a small clip of text and commentary that, again, is video composite. It's not the work. We're going to be seeing compression.
This is probably
I promise to give you a lot of caveats for the video footage if it plays from AV's end. Yeah? So this, just to give you a sense of the movement of the video screens. And feel free to say anything over this, Beryl. We have about a 5-minute warning.
The work starts with tying threads. The work starts with tying threads, and then it kind of moves along to where the pattern begins to fill the screen. It's kind of playing around with the fact that it's line by line, just like the video camera that's recording it is recording it line by line, but at a much faster rate, which is true of all technology as we progress. Certainly in the 1800s, when the jacquard loom was invented and put a lot of people out of work, it speeded up the process of cloth manufacturing gigantically. So,
when people use terms like digital and analog, is that relevant to the way you've thought about your work? Because of this idea that weaving was already kind of computer technology.
Well, it was all digital, but I didn't think about it that way till later. Yeah. More recent times.
Thank you with the clip. Beryl, in the few minutes that we have left, I want to kind of move a little bit forward in time, because I know one of the most annoying things about speaking with kind of video nerd scholars is that they just ask you endless questions about the first two works you made in like 1974 and 77, and I know that you've produced so much work since those moments. And I want to talk about the work, and I know that you've also gone back to these works in relation to the video operas that you worked on with Steve Reich, so they've had these other lives. I thought maybe we would end with a discussion about Florence, since we have that clip with us to talk about a work from 2008.
Right. Do we want to show the whole clip?
I
mean, it's 10 minutes.
No, I think we should just show a few minutes of it, if that's okay.
Okay, so.
Because, Kristen, we have a 1-minute cutoff.
Well, if you start at 1 minute, the words don't start falling till probably a minute in or something like that. So
yeah, we have to wait for the words.
You have to wait for the words, but in a way, Florence alludes to the weaving in a strange kind of way, in that it uses vertical and horizontal cutting up of snowstorms and windstorms in vertical and horizontal lines to build a background structure for falling words that were, in a sense, a collaboration with Florence Nightingale, who went off at a very young age to save 900,000 men from horrible death during the Crimean War and revolutionized hospital care, I guess. She went off to Turkey as a really young woman to do this. And I was caring for my parents and my sister and I at the time, so kind of all fit together. And this is I went through hundreds of pages of her writings and in a sense created a soliloquy, and you'll just see a snippet of her words. It starts out, God has something for me to do for him, or he would have let me die some time ago. I don't know where we are. Yeah, that's fine.
It was actually the other clip.
This was downloaded from the internet from a compressed file today, so
yeah, that's
good luck.
Exactly why we didn't want to show this clip, but if you have the other one that's also
which was also downloaded.
Thank you, perfect.
This is always viewed as an installation, actually, rather than on a TV screen. another work.
Okay, we're going to stop this part of the event. Thank you so much, Beryl. I could talk to you for 3 more hours, but thank you for joining us in this brief conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Solveig and Beryl, for that excellent conversation. It was an absolute treat and a great kickoff to the second part of our panel, Imagining Futures. For those of you that don't know, I'm Robin Farrell, Assistant Curator in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, and I'm thrilled to be co-chairing this panel with my colleague Solveig. And for us, this is an opportunity to explore the formal, historical, and conceptual considerations of reformatting and reconstructing time-based media. This panel was really propelled by examples in the Art Institute's own collection and exhibition program, and the idea that it's increasingly becoming a part of our field to have to either research how things need to be reconstructed or reformatting work that is still in its original format. And we've invited a stellar panel of esteemed guests to speak today, and it's really an honor to have them work through these questions that we had on how the roles of artists and historians, curators, and conservators inform considerations and conceptual stakes in time-based media, and specifically how either an artist or these different stakeholders keep an artist's intention alive and acknowledging that that intention may change over time. So with that, I want to introduce Ina Bloom, who is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, Classics, and History of Art and Ideas at the University of Oslo, and the visiting professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago. Your research focuses on the relationships between art, technology, and media in modern contemporary art. And you have 2 wonderful publications, the autobiography of video, The Life and Times of a Memory Technology, and on the Style site, Art Sociology, Sociality and Media Culture. We have Maurice Schechter here, who is a freelance time-based media conservator and has spent the last 44 years working with video with an electrical engineering background. You started repairing half-inch Portapak cameras in 1975. You went on to do art, film, and video for 24 years, and recent projects include working on the impressive exhibition of Gretchen Bender at Red Bull Arts this last year. To my left is Philip van der Heijden, and you are an artist, and, well, I'm sorry, center, excuse me, Philip's in the center. You're an artist, but you've also worked on Gretchen Bender, reconstructing her work, and so you have the role of bringing a perspective of both an artist and working on an artist's work. So we're really excited to have all of you here with us. And Solveig and I wanted to start with Ina, coming from your perspective with media archaeology and how that the considerations that you talk about in your book and in your practice, how they may depart or contribute to time-based media conservation and archiving.
Yeah, I have to say, well,
oh no.
No, it's okay. Thank you so much. First of all, I have to say I'm not the conservator, so I can only bring, the kind of concerns and critical questions I have. And then I think it's for others to see how you actually solve these things. But what's been important to my work, or what propelled me working with media archaeology, was being exposed to a body of work that interested me, early video art, and seeing how so many of these works seem to be really about technology, not about artists just using technology as a tool to create a specific type of images, but actually engaging with technology as social frameworks and specific types of social frameworks. And when it comes to early video, very much about different types of temporal frameworks, different type of memory operations. So not just human forms of memory, but a different type of memory inscriptions that you have in technologies, and that can be radically different from human forms of memory. And this encounter between human forms of memory and radically non-human forms of memory produced in a lot of the artistic works, at least the way I saw it, new ways of thinking social and political realities. And also, even more daringly, produced new social ontologies, new ways of thinking about what society is, quite from the bottom up, so to speak. So that was exciting. But it also took a lot of work for me, who's not an extremely technical person, from the outset, to try to learn about these technologies, to understand how they were working, to take information from people like Maurice Schechter. I didn't consult you, but I had other people who helped me understand these things. So I thought I was going to show just a couple of very short clips, just for examples. They're very famous, from the early work of Bill Viola, who I think was someone who was really, it's something that always annoys me a little bit about the writing about Bill Viola. A lot of it is about people writing about time in general, about him, time and memory quite vaguely and often very poetically. And what I see, based on what I found looking at this material, is a very intensive dialogue with very, very specific technological mechanisms that were being developed, so to speak, year by year as he was working. And he was one of those artists who had very privileged access to the latest developments. And the key developments that were happening in the 1970s when he was working was a race for time control, right? Because early video, people exposed to early video in the late 1960s had very, very little control over the material. Editing was completely rudimentary, and basically many artists were fascinated by the lack of control, and what that video, so to speak, was a living body of signals that you could only, so to speak, interact with in a very dynamic but non-controlled way. But the video industry throughout the 1970s, of course, propelled by the needs of television, was a race for time control. And of course, the question of time control has, strongly political and social and cultural dimensions, and could be linked to all sorts of memory politics and to all sorts of biopolitical issues and to recent questions of the way in which we work today, which is very much true, or mental capacities, memory capacities, etc. So there's a huge field here. But let's have a look at just, I think, 1.5 minutes from a 1979 to an 81 work called Ancient of Days. And I'll talk a little bit about it when we've seen it. So what I want to pay attention to is the manipulation of time in this tiny clip. Yeah, so that's it basically. That's what I wanted to show. And so you saw that this tiny clip, it opened with, very poetically, with the last glowing remains of a bonfire at dusk. And then there seems to be some kind of time reversal and compression of the original real-time recording. So the bonfire rapidly grows bigger and the sky brighter rather than the opposite way around, as would be natural, etc. But this is not just a movie played backwards. So you can see that this steady zooming in counteracts the sensation of time reversal, which is what we see, actually. Time reversal and time compression. And I mean, it asserts somehow the sense of a progressive time of a living body at the same time as this time is reversed. And it neutralizes the fact that time reversal flips at a certain moment to time progression, at the very end of the section when a man comes in and starts to hammer in what it's, obviously, forward time, not backward time, but we don't really sense so much these dramatic reversals because of the zoom that is completely smooth and gives the sense that this is just one temporal operation. So, I mean, this thing here, this little clip, it's based on extremely sophisticated technical operations for the time. And it's to the extent that this work really is about a story about a number of new features. And I'm going to enlist them. Dynamic tracking, the possibility to speed up and slow down time, which seems like, oh, of course we can do that. Very easy in film. No, extremely difficult in video. And it was only towards the end of the 70s that you had access to speed up and slow down. Time code editing, the fact that you could, do frame accurate editing. That was kind of an analog digital hybrid, also a very late arrival on the scene. Electronic zooms, which made it possible to have a number of different takes, and with each its own construction of time or compression of time or editing of time, but they could all be combined in one smooth progression. And also, what I wanted to say here is that all of these things together is a story about not just human memory, thinking backwards, forwards, etc., but more specifically about machine memory. So what seems to be a persistent theme, at least to me, in a lot of the early work of Bill Viola, who's also writing a lot about video as a memory system, is the sense of video itself as a sort of living, memorizing body. So just to think about time in general, okay, that's nice, but this is really stories about machines. And so machines and knowledge about the machine is really central to what these works are about. And there is a number of works like this. And this is why the discipline called media archaeology, I think, is important, or might be an important resource to conservation or thinking about conservation in these works, because as art historians and as museum people, we tend to think about the human narratives and the kind of human forms of aesthetic experiences that we get from works of art. Media archaeology is something that takes into account the specific temporalities, the specific features of machines, and then try to think about how do they interact with or not interact with human forms of experience or human forms of time and narrative, etc. And so a key question is, for instance, when is the time of a technology? I mean, these days we for practical reasons, we transfer everything to digital, which is fine, and it's a good way of getting to see the images. But the problem is, it gives us very little access to these originary moment of technical problems, which are actually the content of many of these works. So from a media archaeological perspective, a technology is, you know, a medium to technology is, it has its moment as long as it's operative. There can be a technology that belongs to the 1970s, for instance, or the 1960s or the 1950s, but if it is operative today, it has its moment today as well. So from the perspective of archaeology, it's not just a question of archaeology in the sense of digging up the past and having a document of the past. Media archaeology could also be linked to a more Foucauldian idea of archaeology. Archaeology as a certain law of which statements can be generated and which cannot be generated. So media archaeology deals with, you know, the laws of certain technical operations. As long as they can be made to function, they are operative in the now as well. So I personally think that it would be super interesting for museums to think a little bit more about how these critical technical realities, which are, you know, key to these works, could be made, I don't know, accessible, sensible part of the information that is conveyed. And actually that, to some extent, I mean, these days technical museums and art museums tend to be two different type of museums, but perhaps there could be some kind of movements towards more communication between the two spheres, or more interaction, or actually, I think in some cases, art museums have to become technical museums as well, in some sense. And I think there's another moment here also which is important, and that is the increasing importance of infrastructure studies and emphasis on infrastructure. And a lot of recent artworks are emphatically working and reworking the ideas of forms of distribution and formatting, bringing that up as a big theme. And this is, you know, key to all of these works, the question not just of what is shown as an image, but also what are the distribution channels, what is reaching whom, how are things accessed, used, who are using what, etc. So a question of a format, as you know, is a question of channels of distribution. A lot of early video art was about channels of distribution, the political issue and the technical issue. So these are also things that could be, I think, could be brought to the foreground much more, both in conservation, but also in the communication, the dialogues we're having around these works. So this is not to say that the images per se are unimportant, or that the human type narratives that appear in these works are important, but very often they are an aspect of a larger technological dialogue, which has, as far as I've seen it, been put a little bit in the background, and for good reasons, because it's easier to talk about the human narratives. I think that's basically what I should say, right? Okay. I'll sit there.
Maybe I will then jump in with a question for Maurice. You and I have been talking back and forth obsessively about Gretchen Bender for a while. And I think at one point you said, you know, Solveig, I don't think you're getting the full picture.
And I talked to you for 2 hours maybe, and then I was like, oh, okay. I'm starting to understand more of what you're saying. And so without rehearsing that 2-hour conversation with the audience, I just kind of wanted to jump to a sort of meta question, which is, what for you, how are you approaching this question of artist intentionality in your conservation work? Because you have a very precise way of thinking about this that is often very different from what we use, like art historically, when we talk about artist intention. So I would love to hear kind of your general principles as well as some specific cases that I know that you brought to us today.
Well, actually,
Oh, you need a mic, yeah.
I want to pick up on Ina's two comments, and one was media archaeology. That becomes really important when you're defining what artist intent is. And artist intent is defined upon the technology that recorded it and defined on the technology that plays it back. And the experience that you get from the end result of that technology is really what the intent is. And so for examples like, and you mentioned Bill Viola. Bill Viola I consider a model of perfect clarity of intent. Because if you anyone ever saw his installation instructions for his artwork, he is very, very literal on exactly how you set the artwork up, how you set the speakers up, the placement of the image, how bright it is, how loud the sound is, with test methods and test patterns. He wants you to exactly have the intent in the space that the work is being shown as what he did in his studio. So that's part of how I look at, dealing with artworks is what is intent. I can go on.
But you've dealt with this question of artist intent with very difficult instances. So, if, in the case of Gretchen Bender, where you're working with an artist who's not with us when we're having these discussions, and not even all of the media materials are accessible.
So with Gretchen Bender, and I have material to talk about that, I came into the project never seeing the work before, and really not really knowing anything about it, per se. But I had to do a lot of learning and archaeology, investigation, theorizing, consulting, coming up with a system that would be what her intent was, and also to understand what her intent was. And so she wasn't around to ask. I had to look at all the elements that were presented to me. I had to look at, she had multiple source elements. She had multiple versions of works, things that were, labeled, multiple times in different ways. And sometimes the definition of which is the artwork was a decision-making. And that, usually in that decision-making, that was a group decision with, the estate and others to say, okay, this is the definition of the work. But once you spend enough time watching it, understanding her production workflow, the time that she did the work, the methodologies that she did, how she produced it, and it's a puzzle. And once you start assembling all the parts of the puzzle together, you start to see it clicked. You saw exactly what she was intending to do, and and I saw that in her case that it's a visual symphony of images. She choreographed the images in a very symphonic way, and there's a flow of energy that surrounds you amongst all of this flow. And it is a choreographed storytelling of light and energy. The sound, with Stuart Albright composed, and she, edited after the fact. as you sat and listened to it and watched the images, back and forth, watched the images, listen to the sound, you saw that it was her images were cut to the sound. She choreographed both together, so they had a symphonic flow of both, which also means if you're bombarded with so many, CRTs and so many projectors, and you're bombarded by this light in a dark room, which you called electronic theater, black box room, that the sound had to be of equal presence, and it had to have the feel and powerfulness as what the images were portrayed to you. And when all that mixed together, and I sort of, was putting the piece together, and when I actually ended up putting all those pieces together, it was like night and day. It just like clicked. This is exactly what she wanted. No one asked, but it was exactly what she wanted. And, we found out later on that, people that went to all the other exhibitions and the other showings, it was just like it came out exactly what she was intending to.
Do you want to show any of the footage?
I have a lot to show. I need a clicker, don't I?
You need this, or do you need your clicker?
I just want to really want to talk a little bit of the footage, but also it's really also the difficulty nowadays, and with Gretchen and Beryl, which I worked on her works too. Analog works in the 21st century are really getting very difficult and very getting hard to keep that intent transpiring through time. It's not the same as it was 20 years ago. Technology was actually much better in a lot of cases. Now technology is not as good, and we're trying to do the same thing, and we're trying to do this 100% experience, and it gets to be a challenge, to say the least. But as I was going to say some of the challenges that I have, and I worked on, this is going back with a little bit of time, so this was I did 2 works for MoMA on their opening opening day, which was about 3 weeks ago. This work is, I was called in for, this is the artist Pobel, and it's called Snow Crawl, and if you notice that there is a CRT on the bottom of this staircase and a square tube. And inside that square tube are 4 corners, 4 sets of mirrors that touch the face of the CRT and extend all the way to the person's head. And one of the problems is that, and this was an exhibition, being put on, and, like most things in exhibitions, it's always a rush, and we got to get, it to be up and running, but it also has to survive 4 months of exhibition. So the first thing it did is basically took it to the conservation lab there with the help of Amy Brost, the conservator, and Caroline Gill, the other associate conservator at the MoMA, and we basically disassembled the CRT set to decontaminate it, get all the dirt out, get all the, check all the components. Was all the solder joints good? Was there any failure mechanisms that could possibly occur during the show? And one of the things that we found out was that CRTs are not meant to go vertical, because if you look at any television set, the ventilation holes are at the top of the set. Heat is meant to convectionally rise and cool itself. Well, if you have it vertical, the heat can't rise. It just gets trapped in itself, and after 4 months, the CRT could self-implode. So, with Amy's assistant and Caroline, we came up with an idea of putting a cooling fan, in a way that we can basically not have it visible, to move the air out of the set, and to keep things cool. Also, there was issues. It had to have perfect deflection and geometry. So this is a picture that's taken from the inside, from the top of the mirrors, looking down, and you can see it's a perfect kaleidoscope. And that's its intended effect to be. But if you have it with a CRT that doesn't have necessarily perfect geometry, or if it's a consumer $98 TV, it wasn't meant to do what it was doing, and it had to actually be aligned and calibrated for the for this type of experience, which is what the goal was. We also found out, because it's it's a low-cost CRT, Museum of Modern Art's building is very magnetic, and when you actually turn a CRT vertical that way, what you have is called purity shifts, and purity shifts basically are that if you put up a solid color, you'll see patches of a different color on different corners, and depending upon which way you rotate the set, the colors change. So, and we couldn't do that on the exhibition floor, so we basically aimed to get it as close as we could to the exhibition position as possible to minimize any color shifts, which would certainly detract from the artwork. So as we talked about with Gretchen Bender, MoMA also owns Gretchen Bender, which is Dumping Core. That was also part of the opening exhibition. Dumping Core is Gretchen's predecessor work to her later work, which we talk about the Red Bull, is a smaller version of Total Recall. As you can see, it's basically 4 channels with 13 monitors, black box room, which is called electronic theater, and the difficulty, especially with CRTs and black box rooms, is how to make black black, but not make black crushed, make black just black enough so the room goes dark when the picture goes black. And I have here a clip of the MoMA show that I recorded with my iPhone. So you have a clip of what. And you'll also notice that she also used a lot of the images and soundtrack in her successor work, which is Total Recall. Can you turn up the sound a little bit more? A lot of this work is with Amber Denker, and created these graphics back in the early 80s in what was known as CGL, which was the predecessor computer graphics lab where Pixar and Industrial Light and Magic, people came from. She got snuck in at night to create these graphics. Okay, so the bigger project that I was involved with, and this was at the beginning of the year, which was the solo show for Gretchen Bender's, for Gretchen Bender. I really have to thank, and if people don't know that Red Bull actually has 2 art galleries, one in Chelsea, New York, and one in Detroit, and they normally put on exhibitions for new artists, which are relatively easy to do. This was their second venture into doing a dead artist, and a dead artist with a lot of analog work. And when the decision was made to do this project, the time from start that was decided upon what was to be in the show to the exhibition was 3 months, with over 50 CRTs, in addition to objects, paintings, sculptures. It was just, a madhouse. This is the channel layout for Gretchen's Total Recall. And you'll notice that there are 11 channels, 9 are video, 3 are film. And the colors actually represent where those individual channels are placed physically. So there is not, they're not placed linearly, they're actually placed in a very unique checkerboard pattern. And of all the channels, and this work that's 18 minutes long, it's in perfect synchronization. She cut, we talked about, you talked about, Inez talked about using time code and EDLs. Well, this was cut right to the frame. In fact, actually even more to the frame, was cut to the fields. So that when you had flow of images flowing across space, it actually had a very definable feel and look. This is the exhibition space in total, in Red Bull there. Actually, it wasn't too bad of a space, except being circular. It does have, it had acoustic ceilings, which help with reverberation, but, and a kind of carpet floor, which helped with reverberation and sound, but being a circular room was certainly not of the best of acoustics. This is of the last part of during the installation, where we did calibration of all of the displays. And that's really an important part of multi-channel works, especially multi-channel CRT and film/video works, is that each monitor has to be exact. And exact in many different ways, in the color of white, in how black is black, in how white is white, color and hue of the colors. So that in itself was a long and tiring venture. And so doing this, and we had to do all of this while the CRTs were already installed in the exhibition space already. In fact, these are all new Dottronics CRTs. They bought them all from Dottronics. And one thing about Dottronics is, they're not very good CRTs. They're the only things out there. I don't certainly, blame them for what they're doing. They're supplying a need, but what I mentioned before is that they're not as good as what, we all came in used to as, Sony Cube Trinitron monitors. So we had, 2 sets of calibration. We had, we calibrated the projectors, and we also calibrate the CRTs. And that's in essence was making sure, calibrating the whites and the blacks and the color temperature and so on. I had to bring out of retirement, because CRT techs are not common anymore. And my tech that worked for me, actually you worked in Trinidad in an RCA plant building consumer techs and became a master tech. So his responsibility for 7 days was to calibrate each of the 24 CRTs in addition to 2 spares. And basically in the process of doing that is doing rounds. You do it around once, you put them all together, you put the reference image test pattern up again, and then you see, do they match? And if some of them are slightly off, you pull them out, you calibrate it again. And you keep doing this until iteration after iteration that they start to match. Then there's a burn-in period because the CRTs need to kind of burn in for a little bit of time because otherwise they seem to have a way of drifting within the first 2 days of running. So we always kept them on, and we found that after a day it just kept burning, kept shifting. We had to keep tweaking them up a little bit. This is actually one of the problems of Dottronics. I mean, and there's many of them, and just to be aware of, CRT is composed of a shadow mask, and if you ran them a little bit too bright, you would see the shadow mask bend. And bending of a shadow mask, as you can see here, you have a white bar in the middle, and you basically have a green bar on the right and blue bar on the left. That's because the colors of the 3 guns are not matching the right phosphors anymore, because the shadow mask is bending. You have to deal with it. Because there were so many CRTs in the exhibition, basically had to train 2 other crews to calibrate them, and we basically had, there was two versions of TV text and image, which was quite a bit of CRTs in itself, aggressive witness, flash art, reality fever, and then the final, obviously, and then I did the final calibration for Total Recall. Now, simultaneously while this was happening, while the CRTs was happening, was the finding of the masters. You know, up to this point, Total Recall masters were unknown, but through all the effort of what Total Recall, I mean, what Red Bull did, and with the estate, is that her assets were sitting at the Mint Museum, and they just shipped up crate after crate and skid after skid of boxes, and they just went through them box by box, and then suddenly a box appeared with 3 things in it. 4 things actually, was all these 1-inch masters, which you can see. I mean, these are the video channels, and made at Matrix, which is the editing house she used, and the 3 film reels of Total Recall. The projected images were initially and were shown for a couple shows as 16 millimeter synchronous film to video, which is, when you have something that's cut to the frame and trying to synchronize a 16 millimeter projector and a video, it's very difficult. So I think she kind of gave that up after a couple showings, and then used the standard def transfer, which is actually, some of the film footage is actually in some of the channels of the video, so you just use that, blew it up, and to the projected size that you're going to see.
Maurice, I hate to do this to you, but I'm getting 1-minute warnings for your section. Is there something you want to skip to?
1 minute? How about if I showed what Total Recall is?
Yeah, let's look at Total Recall.
How about that? So this is here a condensing of all the channels together in one video.
To a big degree.
Not in the way it's shown, but all together.
When I'll sit and I'll think, then the pain will start to creep back in. But then I can move on with my life, and the pain will slide away again.
Top of the 3 film channels.
So Maurice, because we have to transition to Phil, could you explain once more to the audience who may not have seen the installation what we're looking at here?
So what you're looking at here are on the bottom 2 rows were the video channels. It's an 8. It is a work that is of 8 video channels and 3 film channels, synchronized together, cut to the frame, and choreographed to music.
So you pulled, you abstracted each of the channels to put them on opposite as
So
a kind of map.
So obviously I couldn't, make 24 little squares and 3 squares of, otherwise everybody would have to have a magnifying glass. So I decided the only way to get a feel for what Bender's experience is just take the raw video channels themselves, put them all together, and then you can at least see how synchronous the shots are. I picked scenes where the shots flow from left to right. It cuts from one to the other. You could get, in essence, somewhat of a feel for the choreography of how she created her work.
Thank you. I think this is a great transition to you, Phil. And for those of you that don't know, Phil actually led an effort to reconstruct and research Gretchen's work that was a 3 or 4 year project, which I want you to speak more about. But I also want to highlight the fact that you are an artist whose work is shown both in galleries and in sort of performative contexts. And at lunch, we were talking about the fact that a work of yours may have multiple iterations and it might change, and it's very flexible from one performance to the next, which I find very interesting and germane to this discussion. And I'll hand this mic over to you, but the fact that you said a lot of that came from your work on Bender sort of came from her approach to repetition.
Yeah, hi. Can I go to the laptop? Because I have to, I was going to jockey around with the time and stuff. Okay, cool. Or maybe I should use this nice microphone here. I could do stereo. Or I could hold this one. It's fine. Oh, it is, yeah. I can pass this one back, I guess. Okay, so actually this is great following Maurice, because I can kind of represent all the things I did wrong when I first tried to reconstruct Gretchen Bender's work. So this is actually an image from 2012 at the Poor Farm in rural Wisconsin, this town called Little Wolf. And this was the sort of my introduction to her work, or at least as exhibited in a performative context for the first time. My real introduction to it was I heard this audio piece that she had done called Artificial Treatment, which was the only thing that I could find available online in 2012 when I first sort of encountered her work. It was really hard to sort of find anything. And there were like a couple of things out there, but this audio piece really struck me. And I was telling Michelle Grabner, who runs the Poor Farm, about this piece, and she was kind of surprised at how much I liked the work. But my interest in it is really more on the expressionistic side of things, and that I think the most lasting contribution she might have made to my work as an artist was that I think she saw in technology and software, image making software in particular, kind of like something that was a sort of weird manifestation of a lot of maybe modernist ideas and things like that. So that that there was this sort of really kind of like great dark dimension to this image making equipment, and that I think she explored really well. But that also was kind of, that image making software was kind of created out of a need, culturally speaking. And that there was a desire for these types of programs to exist. And I was really interested in that at the time. I don't know if I just did something there. Okay, there we go. Anyway, so I got a lot wrong with this particular installation, but there was still this moment when we put it together for the first time and sort of turned it on. There were about 5 of us in the room at the time, including Stuart Argabright, who we brought along as a kind of like someone to kind of certify that what we were doing wasn't completely out of line with her intentions, because the process of initially collecting this information it wasn't undisciplined, but it definitely, I would just went and talked to her friends and just asked them about the work, and I knew the basic dimensions of it, and they had all varying memories of it and kind of differing opinions. So we tried to sort of land on, we found documentation of her work from the kitchen, and so we tried to reconstruct it using, to the best of our ability at the Poor Farm, even though it didn't have space for a third screen, that. And we didn't also have the 3 channels of film at the time, so we didn't know what we were doing really in a certain way. But it didn't matter. I don't want to say that it doesn't matter to the work, because obviously it does. And but weirdly, Robert Longo said this really beautiful thing. He said that, this work is theater, and you have to think about like that. He's like, just you're putting on a performance, and that you can put on a performance a really bad way, or you can put on a performance a really good way, and that you just have to try to sort of convey what you think how you think the work is supposed to feel. And then he gave me a litany of his own opinions on the matter, which were like, I think the thing that I remember the most was like, just don't make it look wimpy, like it has to take over the room, and that it has to assert itself kind of very strongly, and that it has to kind of hold you in its grip, which it still did in this case. And so this also is this is a different room at the Poor Farm where we initially showed Wild Dead, and we really got this one wrong in terms of it still looked great, but it was not the arrangement as we finally landed on it at the kitchen. Here's one of our viewing rooms in this sort of like, I don't know what room this was supposed to be in the original structure, but we made it into the room where you could just watch America's Most Wanted's opening credits on a continuous loop for as long as you felt like it. And it was actually really great because for a lot of people, that was their only knowledge of Gretchen Bender's work at the time, was that she did the opening credits for America's Most Wanted. And so we kind of, and that was also, these were also just things that we could get. And then here it is at the kitchen. And I remember actually Tim Griffin saying when we finally got it set up and we were comparing side by side the documentation of it from 1987, that he was both kind of into and sad that the chairs were the same as 1987 in the audience. That's kind of like amazing. So I felt good about that, and maybe even the projection screens were the same, so that was pretty cool. And the TVs, by the way, we found them at a hotel liquidator in Ohio, and they sold us 100 CRTs for, I think, $2,000 delivered on a flatbed. I think they were just really stoked to get rid of what they viewed as a toxic waste scenario building up in their warehouse or something. Anyway, and then in 2014, Michelle, who ran the Poor Farm, was also curating the Whitney Biennial, and we were just kind of really into this process at the time, and so she asked me if we just sort of continued it, into that. But I suggested that I remake this lost Gretchen Bender sculpture as a contribution to as my contribution to the biennial, and it took me about 8 months, and it was a total slog, and by the end of this process, I was so happy to get back to my own work. But because it was I'd never existed in someone else's mind for that long, and it was really hard for me. But it was a really incredible process to sort of try to occupy somebody else's mind, in that way, and I learned a ton. Mostly about how these works were supposed to exist in the world and how they moved around and circulated, I think. So, like, for example, there was actually a debate, and I know this is probably offensive to anybody who has a kind of mind for the archival certainty of a work or whatever, but we thought at the time that the piece contained movie titles from 1987 or 88. It was basically this small window of time right before the sculpture appeared and was shown at Metro Pictures. So there were movie titles that were about to be released, movie titles that had just come out, and then movie titles that were, I think, there was like a sort of 3-month span kind of straddling the opening date of the show. And so you were supposed to feel as a viewer a sense of like an arc of anticipation and sadness and kind of oblivion, I guess, about like, I don't know what that title means. It means nothing to me, or like, ooh, that's about to happen, or whatever. And ultimately, though, you sort of forget almost all of them, right? And so the piece is this really sad, kind of beautiful monster that I feel like relays the experience of cultural oblivion. And so that was why I suggested it for the Whitney Biennial, because I thought that was also kind of a site for the future oblivion or whatever, right? So that there was build-up and anticipation and hype, and then ultimately, after the show closes, it just sort of recedes into the ether, right? And so like, I thought that this was a really great spectral presence in that context, so that would kind of, I thought it would manage that space really well, yeah. So the titles, we got most of them from Total Recall, you know, and then I made a spreadsheet to compare the arc of time from when they appeared. But there was a debate, a definite debate about whether or not we should use her movie titles or whether or not we should actually use current movie titles. And I was kind of wanting to do the current movie title thing, and Gretchen's brother, Jonathan Bender, was really kind of into that idea as well. And but I remember Robert Longo was like, absolutely not. Like, you guys are crazy. Like, that's stupid. And don't problematize this. Like, just make it the way, you know. But I didn't really think that that was problematizing it at all. And I actually think that's an interesting discussion, et cetera. And it could be an ongoing thing. There was even a moment where we thought about making 2 versions of it. But that was like, there was not wall space for that. And so that was just some sort of weird Fantasyland thing that I had going on at the time. But it was interesting to think about. Here's some of the archival ones. This was actually, the one on the right was mailed to me by Amber in like a box full of packaging peanuts, and I was like, I opened it up and just kind of gasped, and I was like, oh my God, this so could have gone the wrong way and been destroyed even more. And then here's mine. Oh yeah, by the way, the one on the left is Metro Pictures, and the one on the right is the Whitney. And you'll notice the one on the right is shorter. This is the true length of it, but we couldn't fit it onto the wall because of a misunderstanding about the length of the work and the length of the wall, but that's okay because, you know, she exhibited it in various modular forms over the years, so we felt okay about that. And anyway, here's a close-up, by the way, of the same panel as this. So that like little panel 15 there, and there's that one again. You know, it was interesting. So this is what I'm doing now, and I'm just throwing this in there because I feel like it actually has a lot of germane to the what I took away from this experience. So this is actually a performance I just did at Issue Project Room, as sponsored by the Red Bull people, and kind of presented by them. But it's a performance I've been doing for a really long time with Stuart Argabright, Gretchen Bender's longtime collaborator, and so we became friends while this was going on, and we just started doing these performances where I would show my videos, and he and his other bandmate, Soren Roy of Black Rain, their band, they would sort of improvise, quasi-improvise. We have a kind of very structured set now, but they improvise-ish to it, and it's pretty amazing. It's a half an hour long set. I'll just show you a little clip here. I swear this will be not too long. Let me see, wait, not that one. I have to like, no, that's, can't really like, oh, damn it, sorry. It might not be on there. I thought it was, I kind of tested it. Nope, all right. Well, here's kind of what it looks like. Like this is some of the animation, and it's this animation that's kind of made using like incredibly current CG software, and it's very much about kind of like a sort of, it's all digital, there's nothing kind of made, there's nothing real that goes into this. And so a lot of the lessons that I took away from the Bender experience were sort of to look for these kind of, these programs, because I was already interested in it when I found her work, and I was really heartened by the way that she would appraise the use of the software, which was essentially that this stuff was made to grab and to hold your attention and to sort of manipulate you and to kind of bring you into this narcosis state. And so a lot of what the performance ends up being is a kind of an extremely sort of kind of involved, hopefully you get about 10 or 15 minutes deep into the performance, and you start to realize that you've lost the last 10 minutes of your life and you don't know where it went. And that's a very different critical dimension than Bender was interested in. I think she was more interested in keeping people kind of on the surface of the video and to sort of flatten the visual experience, but I'm very much the opposite. Like, I'm a former painter, and so I love the sort of like kind of Michael Friedian idea of like just sort of grabbing onto somebody and like here you go, like stay here. And that kind of fixated, more cathexical sort of attention being kind of critical, I guess. And so this work started, almost immediately after the biennial, because I finally had time to get back into the studio. And so it was just studying various programs. So like this is a piece I did last year. This was at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. And it was a piece that I had made that's actually gone through about 3 or 4 different iterations. This is Volatility Smile 3. And actually the whole numbering system and the sequeling of work is something that I got from Bender as well. Just the idea that like, since this work is technological, it joins you to sort of change it if you want to sort of show it over and over again. So the work is constantly updated. So like that's the same with the performances, by the way. The performance is called Dependency Graph, and we're up to like version 4 of it now. So yeah, and this is kind of like what the images look like that are generated inside of these programs. So they're mostly made in programs like Maya, and there's another program that I use all the time. I love it. It's called Houdini, and it's basically just like it's like a node-based visual programming language that you create three-dimensional form with, and it's used mostly just for destruction sequences in Hollywood movies, or if you have like a swarm of locusts devouring a field of corn, that's what it's good for, you know? And if you want that field of corn then to turn into water and then flood the ground, and if that flood then turns into like a firestorm, that's essentially the software. So it's all about kind of instability and kind of hyper abstraction of the imagery. And so that was why I used it for this piece, because it sort of feels like it wants this. These images so want to, or anything about money, I feel like, you know, wants to be unstable like that. So the goal was to kind of make this sort of like casino capitalist, you know, image set and kind of put it to use. And then Stuart also did the soundtrack for this. I'll just kind of show you a little bit of it here, and then I'll stop.
I was just going to say, Bill,
like,
just after this, and then we'll have to
yeah.
take
Here,
it to a close.
Let me get, oh yeah, here we go. Oh, this is good. Yeah, so it's like, it kind of looks very realistic. By the way, yeah, this is Stuart's soundtrack too. So he and I work together kind of on everything because he's really fun to work with. And you can see he's very good at making these kind of doom vibes, you know, really. Although the wind chimes that you hear in the background, that was my idea. Yeah. Because I had to be around these bankers that were going, and I didn't want to drive them nuts. Okay, I'll leave it there then, I guess.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Ina. Thank you, Maurice.